Well, you're very welcome, and thanks very much for coming out on a cold enough all night, and I really appreciate it. This talk is the genealogy of Irish surnames and clans, 11th century to 18th century sources, records, and evidence. The genealogy of the Gaelic clans is very important because we still have those surnames in existence today. And there were dynastic, propaganda, political landscapes encompassing the legal worlds governing inheritance, right to rule and dominion. It's important to remember in the 11th century, the Gaelic clans would have been having a different type of inheritance system than what the eldest son inheritance became, which is more Anglo-Norman. And that came in the 12th century into Ireland. So you may have heard of tanistry or partible inheritance. Well, that meant that it was elective under a deireadh fine, a common ancestry from a common great-grandfather. You mightn't think that being the descendant of a common great-grandfather is very large, but it can lead up to a multiple of 216 people. So it can be a very competitive process indeed. Now, that started to give rise to dynasties, and that's really where hereditary surnames started to come into play, because you had to have an identification process of being able to recognize clans and bits and pieces. You also had a little bit of a population explosion as well. Because in the 9th century, you very much had people being known by nicknames. And indeed, the Irish are very fond of nicknames still. So we have surnames that are linked to nicknames as well. You may find in your area, you have a common surname, but to that common surname, there's linked a nickname differentiating the surnames in the street or the road or the part that you live. And you'd know that particular family by, we used to have the Maloney's above in West Clare, and it would be the small Maloney's, the big Maloney's, the long Maloney's, so on. And ye may have a different way of nicknaming than what we would, because every place has a vernacular. And that's what's really important about surnames when you're trying to trace your family history, that you take note of all the vernacular that's in the locality, because that'll be the clue to your ancestry or your variant. Now, the ruling families and the dynasties are very important as well. You've heard of the O'Briens and the Fitzgeralds and so on, but they come from different origins. Some come from Anglo-Norman, which came in the 11th century, and others were native. So surnames follow different paths according to the history they take. And that's true even for today. If you have Mahonys, any Mahonys here? You wouldn't be called Mahoney in America. What do you think you'd be called? Mahoney. And that's probably how that was pronounced in the 17th century in Ireland. I look a lot at people, deal a lot with people from Canada, and they're speaking Irish in some of those places. They're speaking an Irish form, a variant, a dialect, and pronouncing the surnames in the way that they were when their people left. So it isn't the way they've corrupted our surnames. They've kept a surname the way we have it. An example is Fahy. What would you think that would be called in America? Fay. It is never called Fahy. It is always called Fay, as in F-A-Y. Okay? So again, you have a different way of doing things. While these surnames were going on, you had kingship to lordship. So you had Brian Boru, a very famous high king. But you had that reduction of kingship to becoming 60 to 70 lordships, maybe a little bit more, but quite a lot of captains, all vying for territories and so on, and having a patrimony and sorting out their surname. And we have newcomers and natives. The types of history: historical, literature, folklore, digitized records, geographical, topographical, archaeological and political sources and legal sources all influence surnames. And it's important to realize that, because sometimes a surname will change because of political sources or legal sources, and they all have a heavy influence and varied. But Irish hereditary surnames date back to the 11th century and are amongst the oldest in the world. Some countries, such as Iceland, had no surnames. They went by a different naming system. They developed spontaneously as the population increased, and surnames were formed often by placing a mock in front of the father's name or an O before that of a grandfather or earlier ancestor. Names with the prefixes mock and O were found in records which predate the 10th century, but they did not last. In general, mock is associated with the northern half of the country and O with the southern part of the country. So that's very telling itself as well. Later surnames were adopted, incorporating the Irish words of Gilla and Moyle, and Gilla and Moyle means servant or follower, and Moyle, my own name, Maloney, Whale Downey, tells me that I'm the descendant of a bald priest. Because Moyle means bald and Downey, Sunday, means church. Okay? So Moyle Downey. So some priest
took off the collar.
Must have took off the collar. And we even have a Ballymaloney in East Clare. So I want you to look out in your own area for surnames that are linked with townlands and tell me about them, because I'm particularly interested in surnames that are linked to townlands at the moment. So that means you'd have Bally or Kill, meaning church, Bally meaning a settlement, or land shaffin. I'm doing a lot of work on that at the moment. That leading to a whole territory that's controlled by people holding a singular surname. And that may be their root or their origin. Similarly, many surnames are derived from the occupation of the father or the grandfather. Machon Vard, son of the bard, translates as ward, while the earliest form of O'Riordan indicates the surname origin of a royal bard. So any Riordans here? Descendant of a royal bard, a step above the wards, which is very good to know, isn't it? In case you meet any of them, you can say, I'm a descendant of a royal bard. That was your ancestors' occupation back in the times of the Book of Leinster and so on. Less frequently, surnames indicate characteristics of an ancestor. So the name MacDowell owes its origin to the phrase black stranger. Some surnames have their roots in nicknames. Names such as McAvady and Madden have their roots in the word Madra, the Irish for dog. So, useful to know. Other surnames owe their existence to epithets, indicating a characteristic, such as a Christian or surname, which eventually replaced the surname. So, Ban or Roe or Ray, they are characteristics. So if you had someone very fair, they may be Fionn or Finn. That gave rise to a surname as well. Bon or Ban, again. And Dove. All these kind of colours. Irish naming surname patterns are very indicative and very descriptive. English topographical descriptions are very limited in compared to the Irish language. So topographically, we have a very, very variated landscape that changes. I could take one step forward and be in a different type of landscape in Ireland to what I could be if I took a step sideways. That's unusual. That's a unique feature in Europe. So it means they describe in a different way. And there might be 5 or 6 different ways of describing a hill because it's got different characteristics and so on. And that governs many things as well. Many of the surnames in Ireland today are of Irish origin, in Ulster, so on, but we also have a very strong Scottish influence. We have got Redshanks coming into Sligo in the 16th century, 10,000 of them. And believe it or not, girls, they didn't all go home. So we end up with them influencing the naming pattern. And that takes, and when you're doing the genealogy of that, you can see the absolute influence in the 16th century in the naming pattern of what happens and how it deviates from what was there beforehand. I'm going to tell you some of the sources we use for that. The sources and records for Gaelic clans, the annals, freely available online through the UCC Celt website. Donegal Corran, a wonderful project of his, God rest him, he did this wonderful annals project. It's one of the best digital projects in the world of this type, and he did it years and years ago before anybody was doing it. It was built so robustly, it stands the test of time, as any good project should. It is, all these manuscripts are available up online of the annals, and you'll be able to go through a translation of them from Irish to English and be able to look for various different surnames and so on. The calendar of the state papers. With Google Books now, many of these calendars are available free of charge online. Again, a wonderful way of finding surnames. Probably the most important of all, the fiants or fiants and the depositions, Pender census, an awful lot of these available on the Historical Manuscripts Commission website, free of charge, freely available online. Survey book of distribution, genealogy tracts and legal documents. Full of surnames, full of networks, full of influence. The manuscript sources, Levery Mania, Senecus, the Book of Ballymote, Book of Leinster, the O'Clery Book of Genealogies, a lot of them on the Royal Irish Academy DIA site and so on, so you can see a picture of them and they're free of charge, they're digitised. I was looking at a manuscript in the British Library, on the British Library site yesterday, and it was wonderful. It was a 15th century account of the Donal family, and apparently working conditions, it was 1564 actually, apparently working conditions weren't too good for this surname Donal or Donald, and he said it's been a cold dinnerless Tuesday and it's just before Christmas as well, as he was scribing away and so on. So working conditions for scholars were just as poor as what they are today in many cases. But these wonderful manuscripts are available on the British Library website, who have digitised the largest collection of Irish records in the world. They're digitising. Because it's too expensive to try and keep them the way they are. They're trying to archive them and just have a sample of them online. And that is the way things are going. Now, the Book of Ballymote would have been written in the 14th century near Ballymote in County Sligo, and it's created by the scribes Solomon O'Droma, Robertus MacSihig, Magnus O'Dovagon. on commission by MacDonagh O'Corran. Now, everything's about name. So nobody gets to do anything without being named. It's not like a text only takes a second to produce. This is prior to the age. You're preparing this in a scriptorium. You have to prepare what it's written on. So you have to scrape the animal hide. You then have to do other things with it. So patronage and the importance of a name on that is incredibly important, because it gives you clues as to the formation of names and so on. The historical records defiance, the word is an abbreviation of the Feuds literati patents, which means let letters patent be made. These were the warrants to the courts of chancery in Ireland, which was the authority for the issue of letters patents under the Great Seal. Now, these are a wealth of knowledge, because they're pardons, they're everything. There's so much depth going in there. But what they do is they go back 4 and 5 generations, because they put a whole series of names and surnames linked. And you can tell the network and the relationship between the surnames. It's not just, you see, this is not an individualistic society. This is a society that is connected to other surnames as well. And we're still the very same today. So when people emigrate, they don't emigrate and go to somebody that they don't know. They go to somebody that they do know. And those networks get replicated all the time. I frequently have visitors coming over, and they will go to graveyards, and they will go, this is the very same pattern as what we see at home. These are all the people I went to school with, because the networks are replaced and replicated, and the surnames are replicated as well. And that's important for influence and so on. So the Feuds or Feuds, you can go into the libraries and there's copies of these. Lacombe put together these they're all translated, and Kenneth Nichols has a great part in this as well. So you can get these and look at them and see the sources. 120,000 names are mentioned, and some of the names listed have double or treble patronymics, giving up to 4 generations of descent in the name, and pardons to Irish chiefs, local followers and outsiders who attach themselves to a group as follows. So very important to have a look at that and so on. An example of a pardon. So you have a pardon to Luke O'Toole, Elis Féach O'Toole of Castle Kevin. All the different kind of things. You might say, well, what's the point in looking at these surnames? Well, surnames last, and sometimes they don't last. Surnames become extinct. So if you have a rare surname, you may find a source in the Feuds where there's a great deal of records for them, because they were very plentiful then. And that's one thing to keep in mind, that I may have a rare surname here, but over in America, if I throw a stone in Boston, there's hundreds of them. Or I may have a rare surname in Boston, and over here, there are hundreds of them. I have seen that happen time and time again, because of course, they all might have gone. Lock, stock, and barrel. There's a name that I would be given to mind. Have you ever heard of the surname Moxley? Yeah? That is a common enough surname in parts of America. And that was once a very common surname in West Cork. But they all went. And there's other surnames as well. There would have been a lot of Duggans in Douglas in the 1820s and the 1830s. They made their living out of cattle and the butter markets and been very good agriculturally. And they went en masse to certain parts of Canada. So there's a really strong focus of Duggins in that area in Canada. And I just had a man over from Canada, and we joined the society or your organisation, and he has Cork ancestry. And I'm afraid he spent a lot of the time learning the rude words of Cork ancestry from me, and he was more interested in that than the hours I had put in to his family history, which was of great disappointment to me. And I will never, never, ever explain to somebody what, I won't mention it because it's on tape, but you have a particular expression, don't you? And he has gone now to pass that word around. It begins with L. Yes, well, I'll tell you, that man is fonder of that word. He said, I explained to him what it meant. And he said to me, I know what it means. I have one of those in my building. He immediately identified with it, and he didn't want to hear any more about his family history at all. There are landscape evidence for surnames as well. We have tower houses, ring forts, crannogs, townland names and field names. And, for example, the Fitzgeralds, the later Geraldine Earls of Desmond and Kildare, were amongst the most powerful of Ireland's medieval magnates, and they were lords of independent mini-kingdoms, generously populated with various descendants, legitimate and otherwise. We had the Desmonds, who were particularly prolific. And then we come into the word Fitz. Have you heard did you learn in school what the word Fitz meant? What did it mean? Son of. So you hear Fitz Thomas, son of Thomas, Fitzgerald, son of Gerard. So it goes back to that again. That's really easy to remember how somebody then is of Norman origin or Anglo-Norman origin. How do I know? What do I see? If I see Fitz, what does it tell me? It tells me that's their root at the time. That's where they originate from. Now, there are laws banning the Fitzgeralds marrying into the Gaelic Irish. And we have we have the statutes of Kilkenny in 1377 saying no marriage between the Gaelic Irish and so on. But they go and do it anyway. Isn't it terrible? And they have fosterage, and it stops Ireland being conquered in the 14th and 15th century. And you see the mixing of the surnames and the fosterage relationships and so on. In the original French and the English spoken by the colonists, this was replaced by Irish, only to be replaced again by the English in more recent centuries. And this has a huge impact on surnames, because any language or dialect influences how the surname is pronounced. And the way the Tudors write the name is by sound. So they don't have a BH or so instead of a V, so they might use the letter V. But they'll write it as they hear it. Now that's grand if everybody hears things the same way. But I may not pick up that sound the way you pick it up. So I'll write that surname in a different way. And that goes on and on and on. And it's really important that you understand that it's not the family themselves that are determining the variant. Many of them may not have been able to read or write. So someone else is taking down the record. And I have just done some work on the surname Garavan. It's strongly Garavan in Westport. G-A-R-A-V-E-N or A-N. And it becomes Gavin and Garvan in the States. because the Irish language is quite quick, and it's even faster for Cork dialect. So it gets jumbled up into another surname, and you'll have to be careful of that when you're doing your ancestry, that you realise you've got to look for all the variants. You write down every way that name could have been spelt, and you look for the records for that surname that way. Especially if they're missing and you know that they should be there. That's very important indeed for surnames. Now, you have your evidence, you have some of your they're very familiar to you maybe, some of those. You know? Whereas if you were to show that map in another part of Ireland, those wouldn't be familiar. They're not familiar Clare surnames. So they don't jump out at me, but to you would know people by these surnames. Every one of you in this room would know somebody by a surname there. It's rare for me to meet an O'Leary. Is it common for you to meet an O'Leary?
Yeah.
What does that tell you about the fact that even though we're moving around in cars and we're able to live other places and we're able to be other places, surnames tend to stay in pockets because people stay within certain networks, no matter what form of transport there is. So Donovans, Cotters, Collinses, McCarthys, Sullivans, Walshes, Sheehans, Reagans, Shays, Cahills, and they destroy the surname Cahill. How do they pronounce that in America? Kale. Cahill. And you see how kale then could become kale, like cabbage, K-A-L-E, by sound. The surnames of Cork, I put together the 3 slides for them, so you'll have a fine example of all those as well. And some of those, of course, branch out to other counties as well. So they're not just unique to Cork, but they're quite common to Cork. You have Dorgans, Doyles, Drews, Driscolls. A fine example of many of them. Harringtons, Harrises, Hartigans, Hawks, Hayes, Healys, Heffernans, Hegartys, Hennessy's, Hurleys. Now, Hennessy is a very unusual surname, and if you look historically, where do they end up?
France.
Because of?
They're making brandy.
They're making brandy. But how do they get there? Why do they have to go to France? Yes, and they're expelled. And many leading military families are told, leave or die. So that's how they end up there. Also, if they're part of the Spanish military, they end up there. You can't just become an officer. You must inherit the post. You must buy the commission. There's a lot going on there, genealogically, with your surname and who you are. So it's important to remember that. And there's a little map done up by Dr. Tyrone Powers, who does Irish origins. And I always like maps that just have a look at a focus point of where certain surnames reside as such. The Driscolls, for example, were very coastal because they controlled a great deal of the tower houses. They made an awful lot of money out of the herring trade because there were 150 to 200 days where in the year which you ate what? Fish. So that was a thriving business, wasn't it? And if you were in control of all the herring and control of all that resource, you became very wealthy indeed. I bet you'd be very sick of fish. Could you imagine eating fish for 3 times a week?
No problem.
No problem, you see? A Driscoll, I'd say Driscoll relative. A McCarthy, close enough. close enough, making a great deal of money now out of that type of resource. So we have Cork sources, and they are absolutely fantastic. The Cork records, the Cork past and present places, place names, townlands, and what they have is a wonderful townland, and it's bilingual. It's in Irish and English, because one of the things you should do for any of your surname research is translate it into Irish. You need to know what that is in Irish in case your ancestors were using those variants. So you don't just look at the variants in English, you look at the variants in Irish also. And that'll provide great clues on how to track back your surnames and so on. Some wonderful maps here that I got from the DOI Atlas of Irish Surnames, which is done by Willie Smith on the UCC site. So it's all freely available online, and you can read up a fabulous amount on surnames. I can't do surnames justice in just a short talk, but I want you to have the resources that you're able to go and look up all the places where I found these maps and sources and so on. So there's some wonderful maps where you see the distribution of various different aspects as well. So they're useful because you can see where patterns lie for surnames. And that would be Northern Irish surnames of finding different strands and bits and pieces. And it's a wonderful way of seeing where pockets of types of surnames are. And you might notice that there's the same pattern appearing because, of course, you have the MacMahons of northern counties as well as maybe southern counties. And the argument is that they were once all the one, and then they splintered out, or they maybe were made to go, or there was a clan feud. Do you get on with your family all the time? Has there been any feuds in your family? Of course there has. Well, can you imagine if they got expelled up to another part, or maybe forced out? So you see several branches of the O'Briens. You might wonder, how do the O'Briens end up coming down south when they were so predominantly in Thomond in County Clare? Well, in the 14th century and the 13th century, there was a big fight between them. And they were killing each other for about 50 to 60 years. It wasn't like a row now that you'd have at a wedding or something. It was a generational thing. And it went on and on and on. And to cause, it expelled one branch to another, so you get a strong branch of the O'Briens ending up in Waterford. And that happens in a lot of clans, where the clans get so big and they start to create separate lines, and the lines get weaker in connection. So Tanistry is great when everything's going well and there's an eldest, strongest, or there's a strong ruler to take place. But where there's a lot of internecine warfare and a lot of problems, that breaks down in that clan, and it causes problems which mean either the demise of the clan or the movement of the clan from one place to another, where they cannot stay in the one spot. Or someone else takes over their territory because they're not able to control their own territory anymore. You see it happen in the McCarthys, actually, where there are branches of the McCarthys that are stronger than other branches of the McCarthys. And they actually marry into one another to make it strong again in the 16th century, but the English are too cunning for them, and they take them off and they say, look, come over here, we'll talk to you, and they lock them up in the Tower of London without charging them at all. It's great to not to charge someone with a crime, because let's face it, you can keep them in prison forever and they die in the Tower. That happens to the Canes or the O'Cahans, or the Keens as they become known, from Coleraine in the 16th century, in the 17th century. So surnames and clans are very important as to which branch and surname branch you are. I have the PowerPoint where I can give that out to you, so there's no problem whatsoever. And just where we've got various different anglicisation of names and bits and pieces, you need to look at that as well. Paul McCotter would say the greatest obstacle to the researcher in the field of Anglo-Norman surnames lies in the gross neglect and underfunding of our national repositories and publishing efforts, a story which has remained unchanged since the foundation of the state. So this is great to have groups like this that are so good at keeping records and sources. I was talking to somebody today and praising Cork, saying it's easily one of the most strongest counties for minding its resources and heritage and sources. You cannot go to other counties and think you're going to get the same amount of web or digital sources as what you are in Cork. Clare is very good as well. It's excellent. It has a very strong method of doing that. Limerick is excellent as well, where you get records that, you know, that are just absolutely fantastic. But that's not true. That's not a true story for the entire country. It's kind of important to remember that. The books of survey and distribution, which I was referring to, again refer to a historical aspect as well. Survey and distribution can give you a clue as to everything of what's happening. Survey, distribution. I'm taking it off you to give it to somebody else. And that happens with Cromwell. And can you remember what he does? What Cromwell wanted to do with the Irish surnames? To hell or to Connacht. Or to hell or to Connacht. And he did that in some cases as well. So we end up with a surname in County Clare that is maybe common to you, the Callahans. They end up very strong in County Clare because their lands were taken from them in Cork and they were expelled out of Cork up to Clare, and then there was a change with Cromwell. The restoration happened in 1660, so things settled down and so on. So you can see how surnames move around, and survey and distribution will tell you what's happening there because it gives you the name of the landholders and the names of who's taking them over. So for County Clare, for example, you would get newcomers such as Purdens, Bindon Burton, get the name of the new aristocracy. And that's what you should be looking at when you're looking for your own area of survey and distribution, to track the pattern of surnames coming in at that time. A lot of that happens in the 16th century as well, where you have in England a population explosion with loads and loads of younger sons and no land for them. And they come over here and they're given lands for military exploits and so on. And you find that Ireland is very much conquered in a militaristic way. So it won't be strange for you to come across landlords, Captain Nolan, Major General, because they have a strong militaristic pattern, as is the case in all colonial countries and so on. Now we have some of the most frequently Anglo-Norman surnames based on Matheson's report. Matheson was the registrar, the first registrar, and you have Matheson's report gives you an entire book in 1890 of all the surname distribution in the country. So the most common name down to the least common. So Parrots, originally thought to be Welsh or Celtic origin. This name came to Ireland from Pembroke in Wales. We get a lot of Welsh settling in Ireland, and appears ultimately to be of French origin, originally settling around Glandore in West Cork in the early 13th century. The Cork Parrots obtained lands in Mayo during the invasion of the 13th century, and most Irish Parrots must descend from these related stock. Parrot lineages formed clans along the native lines, and they thrived for centuries. The Cork group by conquering a territory just west of the city in the 14th century at the expense of other colonists. The Barons, in general, Leinster and Munster Barons, descended from the early branch of Fitzgeralds, while the Northern Irish branch became Mac Baron or O'Neill. So you see even though you see the same name, you see a different source there. The Barrys, from the island of Barry off the South Welsh coast, and appear to be of ultimate Flemish origin. From Pembroke they came to Cork in the 12th century, in the 1180s, and later obtained lands in Connacht as well. So you see two branches of the Barrys. And some Barrys will tell you, well, the Barrys got up to Leitrim and in Connacht by walking with the O'Sullivan, you know, the route going up. Yeah. And they'll try and convince you, well, that's how they got up there. They went up with them. But they didn't. They were there beforehand. They had been there from the 13th century. They had their origins there. So your historical facts are important there as well. Bennetts, the French Christian name, Benoit, the name was common and widespread in Leinster, and so on. Birmingham, Brett or Brit. Would you come across Brett at all?
Yes.
Yeah, we would come across Brett an awful lot in County Clare, and especially East Clare. So there's some connection there that's happening there for that. And it could be marriage. Marriage is a great way to mix up the surnames, isn't it? And in Ireland, they're very common of two brothers marrying two sisters. Have you come across that?
Yes.
Yeah. That happens an awful lot. And of course, it leads to complaints by the papacy in the 12th and 13th. It's a common practice, but it's not a common practice everywhere in Europe. So the Burkes, de Burgo, de Burg, they coming here for that, and they becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves, and not known as de Burg but yeah, so coming around from that. Butler, you've heard of that, and so on, and all sorts of things with that. Cody, Cogan, Comerford, Condon, Costello. And Costello is an unusual one in the fact that, do you have Costellos in Cork? Yeah, well, you have them too because they were Nangles. So you have the Angelo, later Nangle. And he later took his name as a patronym to give Mac Costello in English, where the mock is dropped today. The greatest way to look at where the mock is and the O is, whether it's taken or adopted in your own family history, is if you've got records in the Tithe allotments, you'll see whether or not they're using the mock or the O early on. Some are still adhering to mock and O, some drop it, take it up in Griffith's valuation, drop it again, pick it up again, so on. So you cannot do your family history and say, they're not my McCarthy's because they don't use the Mac. I have seen 3 different surname variants spelt differently on the same headstone. So their hang up for spelling is not ours. That is a very, very modern way to think. They don't care whether something is spelled right or it's not important. They're going by a different route and a different way of doing things. And that's really what you need to be thinking of when you're doing your histories and so on, that you are not in any way, you are following the family Bible, which is your family Bible or your family letters or your family sources, and you're not trying to correct their spelling 200 years later. If they spelt it that way, That's the way they spelt it. For example, names can change. Somebody might spell their name Ware, W-A-R-E, and then 10 years later it's W-E-I-R when they move to Cork, Cove. Okay? So they hold it, it becomes a different way of spelling. And it sticks. But it was the same family. It wasn't a different family. Now you have surnames of English origin. So you have Bagenals and Edgeworths and Elizabethan settlers such as the Alsworths of Newmarket Court. That would be a place in England. They came to Ireland. They became very strongly fixed in Ireland. In the last 100 years, commercial activity has led to the introduction of numbers of English surnames. And it's hard to distinguish what proportion of names are really of English origin. You also have Smiths. You might think that every Smith is an Englishman in origin, but it's not, because you have McGowan. McGowan is the Irish for Smith. And it would have been anglicised to Smith.
A bit of a stretch.
It's a bit of a stretch, but McGowan, that's what it means. So you have castles named Smithstown, and they're Ballymcgowan in the records. They're not Smithstown. That's why you need to look at things like your bilingual townland linkages and the link of your surname in Irish and English. The origin of the name, for example, Ryan, experts would say it's Rian or so on, or royalty and bits and pieces. The mocks or the O's become outlawed at various times and taken up again, so you need to watch that they're not outlawed and bits and pieces as well. And that's very true to have a look at that. Language change, dialect change, movement, accent, influence, intermarriage. Prior to the 20th century, one person from the north would not be able to understand what one person from the south was saying. What has homogenized language has been media, radio, television. We are used to hearing dialect. If you are not used to hearing it, you won't understand one word that the other person is saying. So they're all the things that make up surnames and surname patterns as well. Place names, incredibly important for sources and so on as well. And I have a written test, of course, that you're not going to get to leave. I'm just seeing, are you awake? Now, where you get your names, Dove, Duff, Duffy, Cladaduff, all these things, I have a nice little piece on that, and I'll send you the link on it, because it's very interesting to be able to see your sources for place name. And then, of course, Irish naming patterns. So it's one thing to look at the surnames, but I also want you to think of the first names. You need to take a whole record of your first names in your family and see if they're replicated, if your family follow a naming pattern. Not every family does, but some families do. And for example, it would be rare in my family to have the first name John. I haven't found any. But whereas you may find in your family it's rare to have a Michael or a Thomas. Okay? So that replication can tell you, well, that's your branch of the Murphys that lived there, because you're not going to see an Alexander, for example. Whereas Alexander would be a very popular name around Middleton. Isn't that, where you see an unusual mix of a first name and a surname combined together, and you wouldn't expect to find it. And you see it's constant going through the ages, all right? Because we do tend to have a pattern of naming, and Irish naming patterns, sometimes there was more tradition in naming Irish children. There was a British Isles naming convention, but they suggested that the naming of them, that the first son was named for the father's father. The second son was named for the mother's father. The third son was named for the father. The fourth son was named for the father's eldest brother. The first daughter was named for the mother's mother, so on. So it's very interesting. Now what you do after you run out of, like if you've 23 children, is another matter again. I'm not so sure if naming patterns, and it doesn't take into account, one aspect of naming patterns is if you have a child that dies, and it's very, very common, they will name the next child after the child that died. They cannot work out what age Anne Boleyn was, because 3 girls named Anne were born and died. One survived, and they don't know which one she is. So they don't know. It's very handy, ladies. They don't know whether she's 38, 28, 34. That's my excuse. That I'm sticking to it. Do you know what I mean? She didn't. Well, she lasted longer than the other 2, but that is very useful for you to be able to understand as well, that you're going to see, well, you can't turn around and go, that's not my Duggins because Matthew was dead and whatever, because they renamed the child. All right? So that was a very common pattern to have to do that. And I would say since the time began, there would never have been a Matthew in my family, ever. So they're all the things you need to think of in combination with your surnames.
Do you want to know something funny? I have a daughter, Alice, right? And when I was doing my family history, I didn't know of any other Alices in my family. And it turns out there was Alice earlier on in the family.
Yeah.
It's kind of peculiar.
It is.
That a name would kind of gravitate to you.
And Alice is a rare enough name. It's not terribly common to have Alice. So there are certain names like that happen, that crop up.
She had to be an
Alice, yeah.
I didn't know at the time that there was another Alice in my family.
And there probably is going back along and back along again.
And Elizabeths, there's Elizabeths in my family, and my brother named his daughter Elizabeth. But my granny was Elizabeth, and back along there was more Elizabeths. And you see, every second one could be Patrick, Michael, or Patrick, Henry,
exactly.
Patrick, Henry, Edward, Patrick, Henry, Edward, it comes right
exactly.
there.
And names follow fashions as well. So you won't see a Niamh or a Maeve in the 1901 or 1911 census. But you'll see plenty of Niamh and Maeves in the 2011, that kind of way. So it's fashionable. People name people accordingly. So although we have a naming pattern, we also have fashion conscious people of how they... That's right. And in my day, there was an awful lot of Magellas. Have you heard of the name Magella? Magella? Magella! And Tracy and Sharon.
Charlotte,
Yeah, well, there was no Charlottes for us. There wouldn't be. I never came across a Charlotte. So can you see again what's happening with place and
influence?
Yes, and one of the things that you learn as you go along, not to think things are rare when they're not rare. I thought it was very unusual to have the name. I thought this is going to be so easy. She's got the first name, Anastasia. That's grand until you go to Waterford and everybody is called Anastasia. So it wasn't so easy at all.
But even with television programs now, they're calling people out of the Game of Thrones names, Daenerys as a girl's name.
Yes, so lots of things influence a naming pattern and so on, and make it, and nicknames, of course, going where we started today, nicknames, the Irish surnames, oh yeah, but the Irish are particularly cruel with nicknames right back to the 9th century. So you get Tommy the Fat, and nicknames are more common in some ages than others. In the 1901 and 1911 census, you will always know whether a man has suddenly got married or not, because in 1901 he'd be known as Jerry the Box, and in the 1911 he would be Jeremiah Alphonsus James. because someone else has taken over control of the census writing, and he is perhaps not going to be known as what his mates call him down the road, you know. So there's an awful lot in census and bits and pieces.
Is a nickname and an agnomen the same thing?
No, I don't think so. I think they're a different thing. Nicknames.
Would you have any idea my own family know the names are very predictable, right?
Yes.
But there's one right in the middle, and her name was, as they were all Timothy's and all, it's very conventional. But there's one right in the middle, her name is Arabella Jane. It's a lovely name, Arabella, but it never appears.
And what is surname?
Howard. Here,
And when does it appear?
this was around the turn around 1900.
Yeah, you need to look at what's happening.
Yeah.
Is there an Arabella? Is there a famous Arabella? Something? Is there some connection with the family? Is there something that has happened that they've named maybe a beloved? They get very emotional about names in the Romantic period. So you find that they are starting to read novels and books. My mother, for example, was sick of boys by the time she had me. Sick of them. She had so many of them. And so she was reading Lorna Doone. That's how I got my name. Because it's not a typical linkage with Maloney. But she was sick of them. And I don't blame her.
Why, how many brothers had you?
A lot.
Dickens named one of the children Brooklyn, because it was conceived in Brooklyn.
Yes.
Now there's a village in Limerick called Effin. Fortunately, they know what
Yes, yeah. And there's lots of people who would have been reading classical literature and bits and pieces and learning the classics and naming children Paris and Helen, and lots of influences of learning and curricula and how that links with what change is happening at the time as well. So the newspapers are a great source, but I would look into that for the Arabella Jane, because there's some reason for that. There's some, it's too much, you know, that there's a connection. And it could be a replication of a family connection, and it could give you a clue to a line in your ancestry, and so on.
Okay. One of the problems in East Cork is that you will get names that are remarkably similar to the names in South Westford. Like my own name, Harper. But another one is Cott, which is actually the old Anglo-Norman name Cod, which you find down Westford. But of course we thought that, you know, naming somebody after a gentleman, say, appendage, was rather rude in East Cork, so they turned it into Cott, C-O-T-T.
Yes.
Maybe there was a dialect.
Yes, it could have been, yeah.
So you have that. Now what that suggests is that the Carews who inherited Robert Fitzstephen's land in East Cork brought settlers, Anglo-Norman settlers from South Westford, but they also had land over to populate East Cork from the 1220s.
Yeah.
And you know, that's how we end up with a harper beating on the cod and wanted by the shirts of Cork. So
That's how you get it. That's
and then of course I can prove that there's no paper trail all the way back. But the thing is, you know, we have that issue, but we also have the other issue. There's a local name, Bransfield. Now, people look at it and go, oh yeah, they were Protestant, they were English.
Yes, yes.
Hang on a minute. No, it was a Gaelic Irish family. I can't recall the original name, but under Elizabethan law they had to anglicize the name. And
Yes, which is excellent. And there's also Protean surnames. Kenneth Nichols gave a wonderful talk last December on it, and where something sounds English but isn't English. Thornton would have been that name as well. You know, you think, oh, they were English, Thornton. you know, and you see Sean Thornton in The Quiet Man and all sorts of things like that. But they're not. You see, you cannot make any assumption by sound or how that works. You have to do your homework and work out. And then you have something that could sound quite Gaelic or Scottish, and there would be no Irish influence for that name whatsoever. So, you know, they're all the kind of things that you learn as you go along, that you don't take things for granted when you're looking at surnames and the origins and the mixes. And of course, we neglected the Viking surnames. Doyle wouldn't be an Irish name. And of course, you have the famous Jack Doyle in Cork, you know?
What chance has the normal person linking onto some of those names they're alone in front or something like
No
that?
problem, because you can, like, the 16th century finds are available. There's a copy of it available online.
Yeah, but really just the name, but I mean to actually connect the family.
No problem, because you get a very strong trail leading back, because when people are trying to take your lands, they come from a certain patrimony. So you know your area of your surname, and you can work back and work forward.
But we say if you can only get back to the 1800s.
Well, DNA gets you back all the way now, you see. So if you come to a source and you end up with people that are from, there's different ways of doing this now, you know. And that's where you've always kind of been caught, that it's not just about surname, it's about place. Place is, like, you could find out you're a Murphy, but if you don't know the exact locale for that Murphy origin, there's a huge problem for you, isn't there, if you're trying to find out which connection you have. But if you find your third cousin in Australia who left with the Peter Robinson scheme from Shandon in Cork, well, you know that that's connecting you. So you have records that, like, you have to do it piece by piece and bit by bit, and realize that you could end up with people telling you lies, or maybe you find that somebody, like, the biggest problem with digitization is the people taking members of your family and sticking them onto their own tree. That's a very handy habit, isn't it? But you might fall into the trap of thinking that there's some substance to that. You have to verify, verify, verify. Just because there are 3 Wallaces in the one street, and you think to yourself, well, there's not many Wallaces, they must have all been related. They may not have had any relationship whatsoever. None. None. I have seen that. People are very disappointed because they think they've got to be related. No, they don't got to be related. You've got to check what you know and realise yourself where you live and count how many other people have a similar surname and go, am I related to them? No, I'm not. They're a completely different branch. Of a different branch of that origin earlier on, you know. So there's quite a lot going on there and so on. But you can track them and trace them, and you find that they go in networks and they go by occupation. You don't suddenly become a blacksmith. You don't end up with that craft or that trade overnight. So if you have a long line of blacksmiths and you end up with them going to Lancashire and they're blacksmiths, they're not belonging to a different origin. You know what people do, like the cloth trade.
The same profession.
The same profession.
Yeah.
How are they going to make a living? They're not going to college. They're not going off to school or anything like that. They're learning their apprenticeship from their father and mother's knees at age 5 years of age. So if they're in the cloth trade, and they're going over to Lancashire and they're dealing with big cotton machines, they must have some experience of that, because they'll be killed. The small children were sent in to unravel the threads as the machines were moving. They had to have experience of that from a very young age.
So if you see professions in families,
Yes, you need to follow along.
like doctors and solicitors. And
Well, more so, I'd be looking at the other end of the market of the cloth trade, where we've got our working class origins. You know, doctors and that are easy enough to trace. They're in a directory, they're in a record. But if you're looking at the cloth trade in Lancashire and you're trying to match your surname in the 1939 census in England, and you're trying to track it back to 40 years previous, and you know they went to Lancashire, but you want to know that they were your Murphys or your people, that'll be the way to do it.
yeah, I have Scottish people that were wool weavers and they moved to Lancashire.
But they could have come from Ireland too, because they went from Donegal to Scotland down to Lancashire. There's a track. You know, it's a path. One will go, Jesus, Mary, there's work down there.
Yeah.
Both sides are working, women and men. So it's important to realise that that's going to be very telling on how you get from one place to another. Or seasonal migrations, where people would have gone just for the season, yeah, but then suddenly didn't go for the season, stayed, stopped coming back, because there was nothing to come back to. You know, so there are things that like that happen. And those migratory patterns of surnames are very, very important. They tell you exactly everything you want to know, and you will know. And like the names you said, the traditional names of Timothy, and the patterns, you take down the patterns, you understand the patterns, and if you see the same patterns over in Lancashire, and you know that they were involved in the cloth trade as workers, dyers and carters and bits and pieces, you're pretty sure
That they're part
that's
of the
you.
family. Yeah.
Okay.
Lorna, I just bring up one other source for County Cork. It mostly east, north, the centre of the county as far as Ballybourney. It is the Pipe Road Cloyne.
Oh yes.
Because you would think that the diocesan record was dealing with, you know, clergy and major landowners and things like that, but it actually lists the fishermen of Ballycotton, for example. Right? It names them. So, you know, it can go down into that detail.
That's good. And directories are fabulous as well, because directories are freely available online and go back in Cork right back to the 1700s. And they're going to tell you where there isn't separation of business and house, like where you live. You're not going to be living in a different place to your business. Did any of you grow up in a business and that was your family home? Yeah, well, there was no separation. You lived where you worked.
Like
So
bakeries and
it's unusual. Yes, the Toomey bakeries, for example, and stuff like that, and all sorts of stuff like that. It's unusual. You don't have a country house or a town. You know, you live where you work. You're working 80, 90 hours a week. There is no time to go home. There's no holiday pay. You know, so your business relies on, a family business relies on everybody working in that business. And that's going to be the address. So when you look at the address in the directory, well, that's where they lived. Their business isn't separate to their home. It's important to be, and it's a wonderful clue as to which one you're looking at. You know, because every house in a town is a business. Every house. There is no house in a town that isn't a business. It's relatively modern, only in the last, I would say, 30 years that every house in a town isn't a business. If you think of the little villages now and the small towns around Cork, every one of those houses was. And you have to do a pedigree of those houses like you do a pedigree of the people. Because they're all, either they're maybe earning a living, doing a restaurant trade, for the fairs that are in every town, that are going on twice a month. That's a huge, like that, and the horse fairs, especially in Newmarket. So every house in Newmarket in Cork was a business. So we're all making money some way by living there. Because they may have bought farms later on. But what farms could they buy in the 1850s? There wasn't farms to buy. They didn't own the land. Only the landlords owned the land. So therefore you see a diversity in trade that becomes different in the 20th century, because they do branch out into farming and things like that, and buy farms with their resources. But not in the 19th century. They can't buy land that they don't own. There was only 1,000 landlords in Ireland in 1876. So none of the people in the directories are those, you know. And that's where you need to start thinking of how you find people and how you track surnames and so on.